Welcome to Warner Historical Society's second Zoom presentation on Warner during the railroad era. This program is part of a multi-organization collaboration of the Muse Group entitled All Aboard, Economic, Social, and Environmental Change During New Hampshire's Railroad Era. The project explores the impact of the railroad on rural New Hampshire towns and Native American groups across the United States. Our goal is for people to look beyond the trains and stations to see the changes in society facilitated by the railroad. Sorry, Rebecca, it's going backwards. There we go. Our presentation this evening will explore the effect of the railroad on expansion of farming opportunities and the development of mills along the Warner River. What were farmers shipping? What raw products were mills needing to manufacture their chairs, hubs, clothespins, excelsior, and crutches? What led to the downfall of these family-owned and operated businesses? The programs and exhibits of All Aboard are funded in part by a grant from New Hampshire Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. For information on more railroad programs and exhibits, see nhmuse.org. My name is Lynn Clark, and I'm the Executive Director of the Warner Historical Society. And I'm going to be doing half of the speaking this evening, but I have done no means half of the research here. This is by far mostly the research over many years of Rebecca Courser, who used to be the director here and still volunteers and does many talks for us. I added a few charts and a little railroad context, but really this has been research Rebecca's carrying out for years. This evening, our talk begins with a short overview of Warner agriculture and industry before the railroad came.
Native Americans ranged along Lake Todd, I'm starting at the beginning. Lake Todd and Lake Massasauga are the principal water sources for the Warner River, which runs diagonally from the northeast corner of town to the southeast corner before flowing into the Kentucky. Prior to colonial settlement, these falls were used by Native Americans for seasonal fishing, gardening, and hunting camps. Their trail served as early footpaths for the settlers until rough roads were built. Following the course of the river and locating the natural falls, established mills, sawing of logs, production of flax and shingle, and grinding corn for people and beasts. This is a painting that was done by Fernanda Harrington for Lost Davisville.
When the settlers first arrived in Warner, they were hard-pressed to clear land, build a log cabin, plant a garden, and construct shelter for their animals. It took roughly a year for a settler to clear 1 to 3 acres of land. It took 4 to 5 years to become marginally self-sufficient. Log cabins were connected by footpaths from neighbor to neighbor until rough roads were able to be laid out.
The first mills established along the Warner River were located at Davisville, Water, Melvin Mill. The mills ground grain and cut timber for frames, clapboards, and shingles.
The sheep craze of the early 19th century meant timber was cut to create pastures for grazing. A carding mill was established in Davisville and the main village to process the heavy fleeces. Many New Hampshire towns had a greater population of sheep than they did residents. Captain John Denny, an Englishman and sea captain, settled on the hill in Warner that bears his name in 1807. He introduced the first merino sheep, known for their long staple fleece, to Warner. Denny owned several pastures on the hill to graze his sheep and built a large barn to shelter his flock. According to Jack Noon, the sheep boom was in direct response to developments in water-powered industrialism for textile production. The inventive technologies applied earlier to the production of cotton cloth were adapted to wool, and the demand for fleeces increased virtually overnight. Warner began taxing sheep in 1831 when there were over 2,800 sheep. The number of sheep taxed practically doubled 10 years later to over 5,000, when Warner's population was only slightly over 2,000.
In 1775, a cattle market to supply the Continental Army was established in Brighton, Massachusetts by Jonathan Winship Sr. and Jr. They became the largest meat packers in the state. By 1834, the Boston and Worcester Railroad was built, establishing the community's influence on the cattle trade. By 1866, the town contained 41 slaughterhouses, known as the Brighton Stockyards and the Brighton Abattoir. Farm animals, ranging from oxen to turkeys from all over New Hampshire and Vermont, were driven by foot to these large slaughterhouses. The men who herded them along the roads and highways were called drovers. Herds of animals were driven throughout the day, stopping along the road, maybe in a farmer's field, to be fed, watered, and rested for the night. Local farmers were probably compensated for making field space available. It was a common sight to see fences along the homes on main streets to keep critters from foraging in flower or vegetable gardens.
Joshua George, Sibley Wilkins' great-grandfather, was born in Warner's Lower Village in 1791, the son of John and Mary Harriman George. The family moved to Topsham, Vermont when he was 14 years old. At the age of 22, he was employed to drive cattle and sheep from Vermont to Brighton, Massachusetts, a distance of 150 miles. He drove through Hanover, New London, and over Kimball Hill through Warner, Hopkinton, and Nashua once every 2 weeks, following this route for 7 years. In the 8th year, with his earnings, he purchased this property in Lower Warner that he had been eyeing for years and built a fine colonial home.
Joshua bought and sold cattle and horses, farmed, became president of the Warner Bank, and dabbled in real estate. Several of his siblings either never moved to Vermont or managed to move back to live in the neighborhood. They established businesses, managed farms, and operated the George Tavern. The lower village was often referred to as Georgetown because of their influence. The family was instrumental in building the Second Orthodox Congregational Church, following a split with the Congregational Society, when the Society wanted to move their church from Old Main Street to the main village in the middle of 1840s. It is now known as the Lower Warner Meeting House and is owned by the Warner Historical Society and is just to the left of the George family home.
Warner's population peaked in 1820 at 2,238 and would start to dwindle over the following decades. The development of the Erie Canal created opportunity for families to move to the Midwest, where land was more fertile and rock-free. A popular song in the mid-1800s went like this: "Arise, my true love, and present me your hand, and we will travel to some far distant land, where the girls spin and the boys rake and mow, and we will settle on the banks of the pleasant Ohio." The families who farmed marginal hillside land would be the first to leave. Those who stayed behind were apt to be more prosperous and had too much to lose by selling out. They would acquire their neighbor's property in the hopes that one of their sons or daughters would settle near the home farm. The abandoned farm in this photograph was located in the Kearsarge Gore.
In retrospect, it seems like everyone would have been in favor of the railroad as a more convenient way to move both people and goods, but they were not. Railroads were first charted in New Hampshire in the mid-1830s. The corporations were granted powers by conservative legislators that allow the taking of unlimited amounts of land by eminent domain. Radical Democrats balked at this arbitrary and tyrannical power given to private corporations. Passed the New Hampshire Railroad Act of 1840, which repealed the railway's eminent domain and instructed the railroad corporations to purchase land from each landowner along their routes. The Radical Democrats worried that factories would claim eminent domain powers as well as the railroad, and that competition with railroads would ruin the horse and hay markets. Conservative Democrats and Whigs, meanwhile, argued that access to railroads would help farmers get better prices for their crops and open new markets to them. They also argued that, like turnpikes and canals, railways were for public use as opposed to factories, which were private enterprises. There was a lot of debate about how public railroads really were, but public sentiment turned towards the railroads and the benefits that they could bring. A compromise was reached with the Railroad Act of 1844. That legislation declared railways, created a railroad commission to work with engineers on routes, decide compensation for landowners, and put a cap on profits. Theoretically, the state would look out for landowners' rights, but in practice, the state could now compel landowners to sell their property for the benefit of the railroad. We struggle with the idea of eminent domain even to this day.
The railroad to Warner was originally chartered as the Concord and Claremont on June 24, 1848. 6 of the 17 incorporators were from Warner: Harrison Robertson, Robert Thompson, Franklin Simons, Stephen Badger, Samuel Jones, and Daniel Bean. Their purpose was to make a preliminary survey of the route. The individual sums contributed ranged from $1 to $15, and that was allowed as credit against the first assessment of stock taken in the railroad. Why would these men be interested in promoting the building of a railroad through Warner? Several of them served in local and state politics as selectmen and state representatives. Robertson operated a mercantile store in Cooperage and served in town and state government. Thompson operated a dry goods store and was elected town clerk. Franklin Simons served as tax collector and county sheriff. Stephen Badger grew up in Warner and had an established law practice in Concord. Samuel Jones was a farmer, and Daniel Bean was engaged with the mills in Waterloo and operated a farm. These men knew the advent of the railroad would be a boon not only to their businesses, but also to the owners, merchants, and farmers in the area.
This railroad map shows the trunk lines emanating out from Concord. The Concord-Claremont line shows stops at Garrison, River Hill, Mast Yard, Kentucky, Warner, Waterloo, Melvin, Bradford, Lake Sunapee, Newberry, Edgemont, Sunapee, Newport, Claremont, and Claremont Junction. These were the regular stops along the route. Warner also had flag stops at Diamond, Bagley, Lower Warner, and Roby. Outside, a few feet from the track, was a pole with a signaling device operated by a waiting passenger. If the train was supposed to stop, the large piece of metal at the top was pulled down to show red, a signal to the engineer to stop. 7 stops along the route had spur tracks, allowing for freight cars to be available for mill operators to unload needed raw materials and load up with finished products or lumber to be shipped along the East Coast. Farmers depended on the Monday morning special to pick up animals being sent to market.
This is an image of the Ela Grist Mill, which was located off North Road. Samuel Aiken Jr. wrote an order to John Ela, the owner of the grist mill in Warner. He was interested in purchasing 20 bushels of cob and corn to feed his cow. He mentioned the price of cob corn was half the price of corn and wanted to be assured that the price had not gone up. He wanted to be able to pick up his order in 4 to 5 weeks from the date of his letter, November 20th, 1852. He also wanted to know the price of corn, rye, and oats.
By studying the federal census and the Census of 1860, one can plot neighborhoods, the location of mills and farms, and the occupation of Warner residents. 360 men listed their occupation as farmers, and 22 listed the value of farm operations. 30 listed their occupation as farm laborers, meaning they labored on neighboring farms. They probably owned property, but were not making a living on their own homestead.
This image shows the Johnson Farm located on Collins Road, the Merrick Farm in the Minks, and the Cody Farm located above Cunningham Pond. In 1860, there were 99 farms valued at less than $1,000, 90 farms between 1 and 2,000, 39 between 2 and 3, 27 between 3 and 4, 8 between 4 and 6, and just 3 farms between 6 and 10,000.
Studying the agricultural censuses from 1850 to 1880 allows us to track the production of farms, the value of their farm products, and how that production adapted to changes in the market. We first see the influence of the railroad on agriculture in the 1860 census. More butter was being produced in Warner at a time when the population was holding fairly steady. Warner lost fewer than 100 residents between 1850 and 1860.
The real change, however, is in apples. The number of people growing apples rose from fewer than 50 to more than 200, and the value of those apples went from just over $500 to an astounding $7,000. And here is an article from the New Hampshire Patriot and State Gazette dated October 28, 1854. Asa Petty, Esquire of Warner, has sent us a specimen of his apples, real, genuine, democratic fruit, of which he raises a large quantity. Among the apples sent us is one that measured 14 inches in circumference and weighed 20 ounces. Warner stands ahead and can't be beaten, we guess.
This current photo shows the site of the first mills in Davisville on the island. Prior to 1826, Davisville was a site of a carding mill, an iron foundry, a mill for grinding lead, a 10-yard, brickyard, plaster mill, and a blacksmith shop. Many of these industries and bridges along the river were destroyed in the flood of 1826. By 1854, Walter Scott Davis and Samuel Dow formed Dow and Davis and went into the lumber business. The firm handled hemlock bark used in tanning and processed lumber for 10 years. Nathaniel Davis operated the saw and grist mill.
The photo on the left shows the John Rogers Mill in Melvin's Mills. The right-hand photo is the home and mill of Stephen Chapin Pierce, which was located below Lang Bridge. Stephen Hoyt built the grist and sawmill at Melvin's Mills in 1798. Josiah Melvin and his family operated it for many years and rebuilt it in 1827. John Rogers produced milk can stoppers, excelsior, chairs, and bedsteads. The mills depicted in the 1858 map included Chapin Pierce operating an excelsior mill, the Stevens family operating a shoe shop and carriages. Jeremiah Page operated a blacksmith shop. Blacksmiths were highly skilled craftsmen. They were depended upon to fashion tools from iron and steel, repair the hardware on carriages and wagons, and create essential everyday products for use in the home and fields. Mill owners depended on their expertise for repairs in their shops.
The next decade would produce many changes due to the Civil War and changes in technology and agricultural production. After the Civil War, acres of forest cover were cleared to increase the amount of cultivated land. Wood was used not only to heat homes and businesses, but also provided lumber for mills to produce products ranging from excelsior to hubs and clothespins to bedstead. This sawmill was probably located in either the Minks or on the side of Mount Kearsarge.
The Civil War also saw an increase in wool produced for blankets and uniforms. In 1860, Warner's sheep population was almost 4,000. By 1866, it peaked at just over 7,000 and dropped to less than 5,000 by 1869. The top sheep farmers were Benjamin and Levi Couch, Stephen Bartlett, and Payne Davis. Farmers in New Hampshire were selling off heads of sheep for slaughter in Boston by 1867 after the war. By 1871, sheep raising and wool production moved westward where grazing land was cheaper. The railroad facilitated both the increase of production in New Hampshire during the war and its decrease due to movement further west.
This is an image of Oliver and Stephen Bartlett's woolen mill, which processed wool from 1860 to 66 for the war effort. It was located between Lang Bridge and Roby Road.
The Morrill Act of 1862 granted federal lands to New Hampshire for the establishment of an agricultural mechanical college. The state incorporated New Hampshire College in 1866 and opened the college in 1868 in Hanover. The institution was officially associated with Dartmouth and was directed by Dartmouth's president. Durham resident Benjamin Thompson left his farm and assets to the state for the establishment of an agricultural college. On January 30th, 1890, Thompson died and his will became public. On March 5th, 1891, Governor Hiram A. Tuttle signed an act accepting the conditions of Thompson's will, and in the next month, he signed the bill authorizing the college's move to Durham. The school focused on education, research, and extension services through publications and outreach programs. Farmers were encouraged to fertilize their fields to increase production of hay and crops. Speakers were available to speak at agricultural fairs and Grange events about advanced scientific methods and technological advances.
By 1870, Warner's population had decreased to just over 1,600 residents. Over 1,600 residents, but farm production continued to soar. Improvements in agricultural technology would contribute to a continual shift away from hand tools like bull rakes and the wooden plow to horse-drawn mowers, hay spreaders, metal plows, corn planters, and cultivators. This image shows Herman Badger heading back to his barn, carrying his bull rake over his shoulder.
As farmers transitioned from cutting hay with scythes to using horsepower, it meant creating larger pastures from smaller fields. Spring-tooth harrows for seedbed preparation had been invented. Stone walls were taken down, rocks were pulled from the fields and relegated to stone dumps. Barbed wire was invented by 1874, allowing farmers to be able to create new fields without having to build new stone walls and wooden fences. This is a photo of the Johnson Farm on Collins Road. The upland rocky field was used for grazing. The hay field is located in the foreground. The garden and orchards are to the right of the farm buildings.
For women, home improvements consisted of more efficient kitchen stoves, the ice chest for cooling food, ice cream makers, washing machines, and the treadle sewing machine. These labor-saving devices allowed for more production in a shorter period of time. Despite saving labor on specific chores, women still worked tirelessly from sunup to sundown.
Carter's paper mill on the island in Davisville burned in 1868. Although tragic, it led to new opportunities. Payne Davis decided to move to the village to manage the Kearsarge Hotel, establish a livery stable, and serve as postmaster. Walter Davis built a new mill above the falls and formed a partnership with George Dow to manufacture straw board, which was a compressed cardboard. Nathaniel Davis unfortunately fell from a stack of boards at the sawmill and died from the effects of his fall. His 16-year-old son Henry took over management of the farm and worked for Dow Davis and Company. The arrow to the far left shows the strawboard factory. The next arrow is the sawmill. The outer buildings consist of a storage area for finished lumber, the office, and housing.
This farm was purchased by the town in 1830 to the indigent. The county poor farm in North Boscawen was established by 1868. Warner sent some residents to the county farm, but kept the town farm open as it was still able to meet its expenses based on its farm production. Warner eventually closed the town farm in 1889, which was located on Burnt Hill, when it became unprofitable, and the town paupers were transferred to the management of the county. As you can tell by this photo, the farm's fields and orchards were well maintained. There was a large barn and several outbuildings. By studying the town reports, the number of residents varied each year, and the farm produced hay, grain, meat, vegetables, and fruit for its own use, as well as to sell for income to cover expenses.
Cutting ice from Warner's ponds in the Warner River was a winter chore. It was usually a group activity, as many hands were needed to cut, float, and transport the blocks of ice for storage. Ice was stacked in specially built ice houses and packed with sawdust to slow the melting process. If people were not able to cut their own ice, they could purchase it from local dealers such as Fred Clark or Orton Hill. Ice was packed in specially insulated rail cars to be shipped to city destinations. And this is from the Kearsarge Independent, February 18, 1875. This has been a good season for securing ice. Our people have laid in some 200 tons. It is procured from a beautiful pond just outside the village. Mr. Clark cuts the ice and delivers at the pond for 5 cents per cake of 140 tons. It has now been some 48 days since we have had a thaw, a fact almost unparalleled in the history of our winter. This is a photograph of Mr. Clark and his men cutting ice on his pond, which was located behind David and Linda Hartman's home on Willowbrook. This is the Hartman's barn in the photo.
This area in Waterloo was known as the Mill Lot and auctioned off by the Amesbury proprietors to Daniel Bean in 1773. For many years, it was known as the Great Falls. Daniel Bean operated the saw and grist mill. Through the years, various men operated a trip hammer, carding mill, tannery, and paper mill. In 1880, Nehemiah Ordway from Waterloo and Joshua George of the Lower Village purchased the property and continued the mill operations. Portable sawmill operators would haul their boards to the station for shipment, as shown in this image. Farmers would haul their logs to be sawn at the mill, pictured in the large building to the right. An auction notice for the estate of Joshua George in April 1886 describes the property as follows. This is one of the best mill sites on the Warner River, having 16 feet of head and fall, with the right to draw from Blaisdell Lake whenever the water is low in the river. The present improvements consist of a very substantial 3-story building in which are grain, shingle, and lath mills, which is connected with a large circular sawmill. Also a dwelling house and stable with large garden and plenty of room for a mill yard. The power is amply sufficient to run a cotton mill or large shoe factory.
Meanwhile, back in the village, this is the Tannery on School Street. The Tannery was listed for sale on November 27, 1867. It was operated by water and steam power and contained 75 pits, including lime pits, a hide mill, 2 bark mills, and a carrying shop over the yard. Can you imagine the smell of all that right in the middle of the village?
The Clark brothers, Albert and Frank, operated a shingle mill and charged $1 per 1,000 shingles on site. In 1885, they made 30,000 gallons of cider from 7,500 bushels of apples. The mill burned in 1886 and was rebuilt on the same site. Frank installed a threshing machine to process barley and oats. His son Fred took over the mill business in 1902 and continued to press cider. He also cut the ice on the pond behind the dam and sold 4,000 to 5,000 cakes of ice at 20 cents per 100 pounds. In 1934, the ice business was sold to Orton Hill, and mill operations eventually ceased as Orton became involved with other business opportunities.
The first Grange Society was organized in St. Johnsbury, Vermont in 1871. This organization was open to both men and women who shared leadership roles. Farmers felt the need for a more powerful and effective organization to protect themselves and their interests. Some cooperative ventures failed, but others were successful, such as the development of insurance companies and community stores. The Grange's most important value was its social aspect, focusing on education, handicrafts, gardening, exhibits, and neighborhood meetings. The state and local Granges supported agricultural education at the high school and college levels, and also sponsored local agricultural fairs where farm families exhibited their animals and home production efforts. Participation in the Grange also assisted men in participating in and running for political office because, of course, women weren't allowed to vote yet.
Democrats, but at the same time, Judy, for those who want to put the champagne on ice.
I'm just going to ask people if they would mute their mic because we can hear people talking in the background.
The November election, and this is not the first time that Democrats.
I don't know who's speaking, but mute your mic.
But as Trump, right now this election is on him, and he is failing that test on virtually every.
I think I got it.
Good. The Warner Grange was organized on April 5th, 1877 through the efforts of Hiram Patton and Stephen Pattee. There were 41 charter members from Warner. Over the years, they met in several different locations in town. The Sawtell Grange and Melvin Mills met on the second floor of the mill building. The Warner Grange eventually purchased the old Merrimack Farmers Exchange in 1959 to use as their meeting space.
The first street fair was organized by Stephen Pattee in the fall of 1871. Due to its success, despite the snowy weather, the enthusiasm expressed propelled the men into organizing a fair to be held the following year. By 1873, Nehemiah Ordway, an enthusiastic supporter, laid out Riverbow Park on his interval land along the Warner River, and for many years leased it to the Fair Association. The railroad added extra trains to its schedule for the fall weekend and built a separate rail platform at the entrance to the fairgrounds for attendees and freight to unload right on the grounds.
The 8th annual Kearsarge Fair was held on September 24th and 25th in 1879. It was estimated 2,500 to 3,000 people attended on just one day. The greatest attraction was the speech by the Secretary of Agriculture and the appearance of a horseless carriage, an early automobile. Its appearance generated a lot of gawking and talking. There were exhibitions, trotting races, a barbecue of a whole roasted ox, a merry-go-round, and a man who made tintype photographs. Various local businesses exhibited their newest merchandise, from clothing to the latest in cast-iron stoves. New agricultural methods and equipment were introduced. One year, a parade of 428 steers and oxen circled the racetrack. The sale of liquor was prohibited and the drinking of cider discouraged. The Baptist and Congregational societies each had their own food booths to raise money for their yearly budgets.
Our pictures out of the way again. This is the agricultural census of 1880, showing the pounds of maple sugar produced in Warner, and it increased dramatically between 1870 and 1880. It was considered the first catch crop of the season. In Vermont, H. Allen Sewell made improvements to early maple sugar evaporators. The new process required less labor, less fuel, and less time to produce sugar. In 1890, cane sugar tariffs were lifted and maple sugar farmers could not compete with the cheaper product. Fortunately, the introduction of sheet metal tin cans during the war allowed for shipment of syrup. Soon, bottles and cans of New Hampshire syrup were being shipped by rail.
Warner's population had dropped by another 200 residents to just over 1,500 by 1880. New England was always in competition with the Midwest in regards to producing butter, cheese, grain, meat, and later poultry and eggs. These goods could be shipped by rail cheaply from the large farms in the West and undercut the market in the East. In 1888, the first long-haul shipment of refrigerated freight cars was made from California to New York.
Though far from the largest in town, the Eastman Farm in Roby was one of the best, producing incredible amounts of milk, cheese, poultry, corn, and potatoes each year. George Eastman managed the farm methodically, and in addition to keeping track of records and amounts of crops grown each year, he kept a daily journal. In it, he noted the day's weather using an old mercury thermometer and a weather vane to gauge the wind. In the days before weather reports, Eastman learned to predict what weather was coming and when, and many Warner farmers began to place trust in his careful forecast, which he published in the Kearsarge Independent. In 1909, he was granted the Boston Post's first Gold Cane Award for being the oldest living man in town. He was 86 years old.
The Merrimack Glove Company was formed in 1880 and began importing leather to process for the manufacture of leather gloves, chaps, and pants. In 1883, the paper reported they had finished their new tannery building and were processing 70 skins per day. 28 days were required from the time the skin is put into a pickle solution until they were ready for the cutting board. They employed 30 people. 10 years later, both factory buildings burned, and within a year was rebuilt, reorganized as the new Merrimack Glove Company. 7 years later, one of the buildings was again destroyed by fire. The glove factory went out of business. Over the years, the building was used to make shoes, bobbins, toys, baseball bats, lawn furniture, guns, crutches, a sawmill, and a place to store coal. Raw material and finished products were shipped from the main depot from this factory.
Captain Nicholas Fowler built a sawmill in the village in 1829. Timothy Robertson purchased and operated the mill for several years. John Ela was the next owner until his son John C. Ela took over the business. His son Mason soon joined him in this enterprise and built an addition to manufacture wooden box shooks. The railroad built an overpass so the logs could be rolled from the mill yard to the sawmill. The mill continued with various family members when it was sold in 1943 to Russell Ellsworth, Orton Hill, and Earl Nichols. The mill was converted to electric power at that time. 10 years later, Ellsworth was the sole owner until he sold to Pittsfield Box and Lumber Company 7 years later. The building burned in 1964 when it was owned by Richard French of Henniker.
In 1881, Robert Thompson and his son Arthur created the Kearsarge Evaporating Company and built a plant on Kearsarge Street to dry apples. By 1886, the evaporator was using over 12,000 bushels of apples, dried over screens, and heated with 75 tons of coal. The core and skins were dried and sent to Philadelphia to be used in the production of jelly. The Thompsons also shipped 3,000 barrels of No. 1 Baldwin apples. Another evaporator was also set up in Melvin Mills, and the dried product was shipped from the Melvin station. Unfortunately, the plant in Warner was lost to fire in September 1894 at a loss of $4,000. A small building was saved and production continued, but on a smaller scale. Warner businessman Andrew Hook purchased the business, and it stayed in operation until 1910. Then Milton Wadley from Sutton operated it for one more year. Local grocery store owner George Martin purchased the property to build his fine home, currently the home of Clyde and Kathy Carson. He dismantled the evaporator building and used part of the lumber in the construction of his garage.
This notice that you see on the left was repeated weekly in the Kearsarge Independent throughout October and November 1887. Wanted. All the cider apples in New Hampshire. We expect to load upon all railroads in the state. Save the crop and inquire of local agent A.C. and E.H. Carroll, Warner, New Hampshire. By November, the Carrolls had shipped 2 carloads of apples from Warner to Sherburne, Mass., a number of cars having been sent previously. They had purchased over 100,000 bushels of apples from throughout the state. By December 16th, they closed down the cider apple business for the year and reported shipping 175,000 bushels, or about 800 carloads, equivalent to a train of cars nearly 3 miles long.
In 1886, Walter and Henry Davis sold the Davis Brothers Mill in Davisville to the American Straw Board Company. Walter decided to purchase the water power and mills in Kentucky Village. He erected a new mill for the Brainerd Silk Company, with one floor being used by the Kingsbury and Davis Machine Company to manufacture paper boxes. Walter continued to invent various machines and parts for machines, particularly with turbine water wheels. In 1897, Henry Davis and his nephew Horace formed a new corporation, the Davis Straw Board Company, and repurchased the plant in Davisville to manufacture paper box board. Walter Davis, the inventor, died on November 1st, 1899.
In April 1887, over 114 tons of freight were shipped from the Roby station. Also shipped were 2,730 pounds of maple syrup and sugar, most of which came from Sutton producers.
In 1897, Frank Rawlins, depicted here, a Concord lawyer, Republican, and state politician, broached the idea of Old Home Week. This was in response to New Hampshire's dwindling population, abandoned farms, and the economic downturn of many rural communities in New Hampshire. I wish that in the ear of every son and daughter of New Hampshire, in the summer days, might be heard whispered the persuasive words, come back, he wrote in 1897. Do you not hear the call? What has become of the old home where you were born? Do you not remember it? The old farm back among the hills with its rambling buildings, its well sweep casting its long shadows, the row of stiff poplar trees, the lilacs and the willows. Frank Rawlins served as governor from 1899 to 1901 and encouraged people to purchase old farms, to spruce them up and use them as summer homes. Towns were urged to improve their main streets with lighting and sidewalks, to renovate public buildings and create new monuments. This was a time when a lot of communities established their Civil War statues. He founded Old Home Week Association and presided over the state's first homecoming as governor. This is an example of an ad that was placed for the sale of farms. March 23rd, 1894, for sale. The subscriber offers for sale his farm known as the Whittier Farm. The buildings include a one-story house and shed attached, one barn and 2 sheds, one wagon shed. All are in good repair. The house and barn are supplied with pure running water. The whole is pleasantly situated on the western slope of the Mink Hills in the town of Warner, 2.5 miles from the B&M Railroad Station at Melvin Mills. It commands a good view of the beautiful Lake Massasecum and is about 5 miles from Simons Free High School. It's in a good state of cultivation, grows plenty of good apples, cuts 22 tons of hay, and contains 90 acres, suitably divided into woodland, pasture land, and tillage. Henry Brown, Melvin Mills.
New England farmers turned to dairy production by the 1890s, and every morning farmers hauled their milk cans to the various railroad stations in Warner for shipment to city creameries for processing. Cream separators came into use in the mid-1890s. Walter Flanders, shown here, had a route for picking up milk from farmers and delivering cans to and from the station, and you can see the milk cans tucked under the tarp behind him in the wagon.
Fred Myron Colby wrote about Stephen Pattee and his farming methods. Previous to 1862, Pattee pursued mixed farming. He made fine wool a specialty, and when the market collapsed, he switched to the coarse wool market and market lambs. He raised and bred excellent horses. For several years, his milk production was his leading line. his cows being Great Holsteins and Jerseys, allowing for quantity of production as well as an increased butterfat content. He was so successful at raising wheat, he was awarded a diploma and bronze medal for corn shown at the Chicago exhibition in 1893.
The farm increased from his father's original 60 acres to over 300 acres, while 2 new houses were erected and the barn received an addition. It is known as Maple Grove Farm and contains 150 acres, while the rest of his pasture and woodland are located further up the road to Kearsarge. 30 acres is reserved for tillage, the soil being light and loamy. Everything has the appearance of thrift. Everything is first class. Young and luxuriant orchards, grapes and strawberries in the field, apples stored year-round in his cool cellar. A very large vegetable garden is attached to the house.
Stephen Pattee does not waste time, and many modern labor-saving machines are in daily use. The first mowing machine ever used in town was used on his land in 1863. Not only does Stephen Pattee try new methods, he writes about them as a paid correspondent of the People and Patriot, Boston Cultivator, the New England Farmer, Country Gentleman, and various other agricultural presses. He is often a featured speaker at Grange meetings and agricultural fairs.
A voice that's often missing from town histories is that of women. Frances Chase kept daily entries of her work in the early 1900s. In between entries about her family or who visited, she recorded the daily grind of housework, laundry, cooking, feeding the hens and pigs, and seasonal work such as putting up garden produce and storing apples. She took in laundries for the neighbors, sold soap and eggs to raise money for her own independence, as her husband wasn't very forthcoming with money for her personal or household expenses.
Farmers delivered their grain, usually oats, barley, or wheat, to the door located under the overhang on the gable end of Ela gristmill. The grain would empty into a chute to the lower hop, which Jacob Rodney is holding. Behind Rodney is another grinding wheel, which may have been used for a different type of grain. Imagine the sound of the wheel grinding corn and feeling the rumble underneath your feet. Take note of the woven basket on the floor.
And I didn't hear it, so you might not have, that this was the illustration of the Ela gristmill. But yes, take note of this basket here on the floor. It's similar to the bushel baskets that William Haskell, a black man, wove at his shop on Upper Main Street in Warner. In 1881, Haskell's baskets were described as being as good as could be found on the market. He did the work by hand and in 8 months produced 400 baskets. He often stamped the handle with his name, W. Haskell. The Warner Historical Society and Canterbury Shaker Village have Haskell baskets in our collections.
Charles Graves, a farmer on Waldron Hill, kneels in a freshly plowed field. His daughter Ella holds the finely matched team of horses bathed in the dappled spring light. The field behind them has been harrowed, and Graves is picking up rocks, otherwise known as the annual crop of field potatoes, which was a tedious spring chore. Children often worked as hard or harder than hired help. Dory Henley wrote about working with horses. We had a team that Dad used to plow the fields and cultivate the crops. One of our chores was to ride the horse, to guide them down the path and not let them get too far one side or the other and pull the equipment in a direction that Dad did not want it to go. This was a difficult task on a side hill farm.
A cooperative creamery was established at the foot of Mill Street in January 1902, and you can see the milk cans on the lined up on the stoop. Within 2 years, it became the Kearsarge Creamery, operated by Deerfoot Farms. Cream sold for 40 cents per quart. Within a year, the business was purchased by the Cold Process Company of New York. The business averaged 1,400 pounds of butter per week, and 225 gallons of milk was separated on a daily basis. It was a boon to local farmers, as the creamery paid a higher premium for milk than shipping it on the train. 10 years later, Warner resident Carl Cutting was the manager. He purchased a commercial ice cream maker, which proved to be a popular attraction. He was known for handing out flavorful samples for his visitors. In 1917, Nicholas Nasikas, a recent Greek immigrant from Manchester, leased the space and produced cheese from goat's milk.
This is a sketch of the Warner Chemical Company done by Charlie Brown. In April 1900, George Gaffney purchased the old fairgrounds to build a wood alcohol plant, which also produced charcoal and acetate. Shipping of the products was facilitated by a spur track from the railroad right-of-way to the old fairgrounds. The plant burned in 1904, and the site sat empty until December 1917, when Gaffney rebuilt and named it the Warner Chemical Company. 3 years later, it burned again and was rebuilt. In 1926, it was sold to the Newbert Color Company. Within 3 years, it burnt again and was rebuilt, this time with fireproof steel construction. The American Cyanamide and Chemical Company began the manufacture of dyes to color cloth for khaki uniforms. In November 1943, the plant closed and was sold for salvage. It had been the third largest taxpayer in town and employed many people.
Henry Russell Davis, upon graduation, worked in the mill at Davisville. Family history states, Henry worked 6 days a week, 12-hour days, from noon to midnight or midnight to noon, for $7.50 a week. He had to fire 4 boilers with 4-foot cords of wood that had been dumped from wagons or sleds down into a pit. On Sundays, the boilers were cleaned by 2 men. In 1903, the mill closed. By 1906, Henry and Horace Davis organized the Davis Paper Company, located at West Hopkinton, enlarging the water power and establishing one of the best plants for the manufacture of leatherboard to be found in all New England. All of the equipment from the old paper mill in Davisville was moved to West Hopkinton. The water power rights and buildings were acquired by the Kentucky Electric Company, which served Kentucky, Hopkinton, and Warner. The buildings were torn down and a new brick power plant was built downriver from the dam. There would be a sharp decrease in freight shipped from the Diamond Station because of the moving of the mills.
The 3 generations of Carroll men, Alonzo, Edward, and Lee, were very involved in the business and social interests of Warner. Over the years, they were invested in the hotel trade, a dry goods store. One of them served as postmaster. They had banking interests. They invested in the Merrimack Glove Factory, bred Morgan horses, and managed agricultural and lumbering opportunities. Edward also served as town moderator, county treasurer, a legislator, and an executive counselor.
Edward and Lee purchased this 40-acre property on Denny Hill, as you recall, which was once owned by Captain Denny. Denny had introduced merino sheep to Warner in the early 1800s. Denny's smaller fields were cleared of rocks and stone walls, erasing any evidence of the foundations and fields. The field was fertilized and seeded for hay production based on agricultural advice from the Department of Agriculture. The improvement yielded crops of timothy and red top, averaging about 3 tons of well-cured hay per acre. Edward Carroll and his dog are sitting in the carriage surveying the men loading the hay racks. Lee Carroll, his son, is the man wearing the bow tie, standing next to the load of hay.
This is an image of the Carroll Hay Wagons on Main Street, August 1st, 1913, Kearsarge Independent. Each Carroll and son have finished haying, cutting 127 loads, averaging 1,570 pounds each in 18 days. They took 111 loads from 40 acres on land on Denny Hill. They carefully weighed the hay from one piece, which measured less than 4 acres, and it totaled 26,300 pounds. They intend to further improve the field recently purchased of Charles Bartlett and anticipate a larger crop of hay another season, which has been brought about by fertilization with chemicals.
Ralph Pratt took this image of 40 tons of hay creatively stacked on Waldron Hill. Large tarps had been placed on top of the hay and weighted down with ropes and tree limbs in an attempt to keep it from blowing away or getting soaked in summer storms. A young boy is perched on the ladder. It would have been a challenge to climb to the top of the stack to pitch hay down to a waiting wagon.
The increased population in New England cities meant residents looked to the local market for dairy products, vegetables, fruit, meat, and eggs. Market gardens were created to supply food for cities and the local hotels and boarding houses, shown here in Warner.
Agricultural and domestic art classes at Simons Free High School were first offered in 1914. The agricultural classes dealt with vital and practical problems farm life emphasized. Farm projects were required of all students, including the care of crops, animal husbandry, dairying, horticulture, poultry, and farm management. The boys also took shop classes to deal with the maintenance of farm equipment and tools. Domestic arts required classes in textiles and clothing, food and nutrition, home care and its management, first aid, child care, and care of the sick, with accompanying lab work.
Miriam Savory shared a memory of the milk trains. Every weekday morning, people from surrounding farms sold milk, drove in with big cans full, and unloaded them at the platform in Bagley. When the down train came about 8:30 a.m., the milk purchased by the Whiting Company was loaded in the milk car and shipped to its city destinations. Catherine Bean Henley, shown here on the right, is carrying her milk jugs at the Warner Depot. Milk cans had a tag with the farmer's name, and cans were later returned to the platform on the up train.
E.H. Carroll and Son have drawn to the stations at West Andover, Northfield, Roby's Corner, and Warner during the month of January more than 1 million feet of lumber, being the largest movement of this commodity they have ever made in 1 month since their lumbering operation began 17 years ago. Kearsarge Independent, February 2nd, 1917. Lee Carroll attended Concord Business School after high school and joined his father in the family business. They embraced modern ideas, up-to-date inventions, and different people. The paper noted they hired gangs of Polish workers to cut lumber and work in the mills. A 4-ton motor truck replaced some of the work done by teams of horses. They embraced conservation ideas, and reforestation began on their timber lot.
The Dodge Mill, which is sawing lumber for E.H. Carroll and Son on the Minks, has been moved further up the hill, and a chute between 1,400 and 1,500 feet long with a drop of about 350 feet has been built to get the sawed lumber down where it can be hauled away to the station. Kearsarge Independent, April 6, 1917. Unfortunately, the father, Edward, died in 1917, and then Lee, his son, was stricken during the 1919 influenza epidemic after being sick for just a few days. That left his mother, Susie, his wife, Edith, and 2 young sons, Edward and James. Unfortunately, Susie and Edith had to sell off the variety of businesses and land holdings as they were unable to manage the large operations. The Carroll family had been innovative, industrious, and successful in their various business affairs. They contributed to the economy of Warner by paying their tax bill, improving the prosperity of farmers by purchasing their apples and timber, and employing a variety of people throughout the state.
Carl Momberg wrote in the Town History that despite the decrease in agricultural activity, farms continued to contribute much to the economy of Warner from the 1880s until the 1930s. Most farms had dairy cattle, sheep, hogs, and horses. There were loading ramps at the train stations for ease of loading animals for shipment to markets. The depression of the 1930s dealt a blow to agriculture as well as to industry and business. Each spring and fall, cattle were driven to and from the pastures on Mount Kearsarge for summer grazing. Prices and farm income was low, but at least families were able to produce most of their own food. During the 1930s, from 12 to 15 farms produced milk for market, most of it being sold wholesale. 2 farmers in Warner established milk routes on different sides of town. Apples still brought in income during the 30s, as a few carloads were shipped each fall. Several people in town also sold poultry and eggs. John Dwinnells carried on a successful turkey farm on Scuda Road.
The 1939 commercial agricultural production map of Warner showed 22 farms raising cattle. Several of these farms had cattle 3 to 32 head. Fred Courser Jr. on Scuda had 32. Arthur Esty and Ray Bradbury in Bagley had 26. George Roberts on Burnt Hill had 17, followed closely by Win Chase on Torrey Hill with 16.
There were 10 poultry farms raising between 100 and 850 hens. Roy Gookin in Lower Warner had the most with 850. Stanley Morgan on North Village Road had 600, and Fred Brewersdorf at Melvin Mills had 550.
On Saturday morning, the Merrimack County Dairy Tour and Homemakers Day was greatly enjoyed with a large audience. Visits were made to the home of Mrs. Harold Hood at Red Chimney, who was the winner of the Kitchen Improvement Contest. An interesting illustrated lecture on pasture improvement by Professor D.B. Johnston Wallace of Cornell proved very beneficial to a large group of listeners who gathered at the town hall. At noon, the gathering visited the fine Kearsarge Stock Farm on Burnt Hill, owned by George Roberts, where a basket lunch was featured and a fine address was given by Andrew Faulkner, Commissioner of Agriculture.
In the afternoon, a visit to the farms of Winifred Chase and George Freeman of Torrey Hill concluded the day's activities. And Rebecca, which farm is this one?
Win Chase's. Fred Courser Sr. and his wife Laura purchased the Richard Straw Farm on Scudic Road in 1903. Fred owned farms and woodlots in other towns and focused on buying and selling cattle and managing the woodlots for cordwood and timber harvesting. The Courser family also purchased their cattle and many cattle from other farmers on the slope of Mount Kearsarge during the summer. After his death in 1933, his son, Fred, and wife took over management of the business affairs. Fred Jr. married classmate Margaret Bartlett in 1937. The Rural Free Electrification Act was passed in 1936, but electricity did not reach the farm until after World War II. Gerald Courser can remember holding the lantern while his father milked the cows and did chores in the barn. Both Fred and Margaret were involved with community activities from church, Masons, Eastern Star, the Odd Fellows, the local Grange. Fred added raising sheep to the mix and carried on an extensive sheep shearing route in Vermont and New Hampshire every spring. Meanwhile, Margaret planted a large home garden, raising food for the family and selling anything extra to help make ends meet.
Horses provided much of the power until the 1940s when tractors came into use. During World War II, the State Board of Vocational Education opened its first school-operated community food preservation plant, where folks in Warner and neighboring towns could can in tin anytime without charge under the direction of experts and using modern steam pressure equipment. Vocational and commercial students at Simons Free High School renovated the former Jewel Garage into a big white kitchen where 150 cans of home food could be processed within an hour. After the war, the Canning Center lost its governmental funding, and local citizens raised money to turn the center over to Simons Free High School. Between 16 and 20,000 cans of fruits, vegetables, meats, poultry, and cooked dishes were processed during the growing season. There were charges of 3 to 4 cents to seal each can. Margaret Courser was the instructress, and Oscar Elmendorf was the engineer.
Dory Clark Henley shared another memory about their farm called Samacan, located on Pumpkin Hill. She says, "My dad worked in the store part-time until he got the farm going in pretty good shape and established a milk route. We had a series of hired men that would come and help. My brother tended the stock and I helped in the milk room. I had to wash aerators, separators, change the water, and clean out the milk coolers on the weekends. I had to wash the milk bottles, and bottling milk was a daily chore. We had an extensive milk route. We would go up Kearsarge Street as far as Hill Box, up Main Street to Waterloo and Roby. Then we would go down as far as Pleasant Lake. At first, we would go every day. and then we switched to every other day. Then we did one side of town one day and the other side the next. At first, we had a Scuda baker with a back seat removed. Then we switched to a pickup truck. We separated out the cream and whey, and there was plenty of extra butter and cottage cheese. A quart of milk cost 10 cents.
In the 1930s, milk was no longer shipped by train. The Manchester Dairy picked up milk cans at larger farms and at designated stops along the highway. This is a painting by Charlie Brown of Milk Can Corner, located at the junction of Scuda Road and Route 103. And you can just see the milk cans in the bottom right corner of the painting. Between 1900 and 1969, the number of farms in Merrimack County decreased from almost 4,000 to just 409.
This mill in Melvin's was used for carding wool at one point. It shared water power with the Melvin Saw and Grist Mill located across the river. Later, this is where John Rogers manufactured chairs and bedsteads. Robert Thompson installed an evaporator to dry apples. Then Frank Sawtell manufactured chair stock and let the Grange use the second floor of the for meetings and social events, and it was known as Sawtell Grange. Bill Dowling purchased the property in 1946 and established the Dowling School Supply Company, which converted big rolls of paper he received by rail into school paper supplies.
In 1951, Earl Nichols built a new electric sawmill and lumberyard on the interval, now the site of Market Basket. Besides sawing lumber, the mill made grade stakes, wood chips, and bark mulch. Through Earl's connection from his time at Ela Box, he struck up a relationship with Bridge Manufacturing from Hazardville, Connecticut. Bridge purchased box shooks, knockdown boxes, from Ela Box. Bridge suggested to Earl he start a real manufacturing plant and they would furnish the business. A requirement was they needed a rail siding. Earl purchased property in Bradford and built Kearsarge Reel. They shipped by rail for a time, but by 1960 had switched over to trucking their material.
The Hill Box Company, founded by Orton Hill and his son John, built their shop on Kearsarge Street in August 1950. They produced wooden panels used to make the circular ends of the cable reels. 15 men were employed at the start of their business. The panels were shipped to the Bridge Company in Connecticut and also trucked to the Kearsarge Reel Company in Bradford to be made into the finished product of cable reels. They soon switched to trucking as well.
The last passenger train stopped in Warner on November 4th, 1955. Freight traffic dropped substantially between 1955 and 1961 from 191 cars of freight compared to only 84 in a whole year in 1961. The advent of good highways and efficient trucks led businesses and companies to bypass the railroad option and thus ended the railroad era. Join us on July 16th to learn about hotels, boarding houses, and summer visitors in the railroad era. Email info@warnerhistorical.org to receive the Zoom link just for this free program. And also check out our Torrey Hill Authors Series on 4 Saturday evenings in July and August. Tickets for those are $5 each. You can also receive the Zoom link upon purchase online. And now let's unmute everybody. Stop sharing. And unmute everybody.
Thank you.
So if anyone has a question, go ahead and ask.
Lynn,
Yes.
Lynn, you mentioned the turkey farm on Scuda Road.
Yes.
I just wanted to add that my daughter and son-in-law have lived there for like 23 years.
Wow.
Yes. And what used to be the slaughterhouse, which was on the other side of the driveway, they've turned into a nice little cottage.
That's Clyde and Kathy.
Anybody else have a memory or a question?
He's getting bumped out.
I'm curious about the Whittier Farm, that they had a view of Lake Massasoit where I grew up. So I was trying to figure out where, was that Bible Hill?
No, it was on Collins Road, almost to the very end. It's a white, well, it used to be white house on the left-hand side. I think it's now owned by the Browns.
In Waterloo?
No, Melvin Mills.
Melvin Mills.
Lake Massey.
Duncan. Why do I know that name? Such a,
Anyone else?
Andy Duncan?
I don't know.
Any questions or reminiscences? Well, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And like I said, we'll be doing one more talk relating to the railroads on July 16th. And check out our Torrey Hill Offer Series as well. And anyone else who might be doing a railroad program, you can see it at nhmuse.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn.
Night.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks so much.
Good night. Good night.
Bye.
Night. Great job. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.